Hi everybody. We are in week 13 and now we're moving on to finishing, which is basically the last stage in the fabrication process. So this week we're going to be focusing on chapters 16 through 18, and then next week we will wrap up with chapter 19.
We will start with an overview of finishing. The definition of finishing is any process that is done to a fiber or yarn or fabric, and it will change the appearance, the hand, or the performance of that fiber, yarn, or fabric. So that is a general overview of what a finish is. There's a very good diagram on page 404, figure 16.1, that outlines a typical production sequence for textile fabrics. And actually, that's pretty much how this whole semester has been tracking in terms of what we've learned. We've learned about fibers, processing, the fabrics, and now we're going to overview the finishing process. Some finishes can take place early on in the process, but in most cases, the finishing occurs at the end. You also have a couple of terms here. We've already learned about gray goods, but I want to reiterate gray goods again, that those are fabrics that have been produced, but they have not been finished yet in terms of wet or dry finishing. So normally gray goods will be undyed, and then once you dye them and finish them, they are considered converted or finished goods.
Here's a link to a video, and the link is also on campus, but it provides a really good overview of everything we're going to be talking about both this week and next week. So there is a bit of a focus more on printing and dyeing, which is the topic of next week's lecture. However, again, it's just a really great overview as to the overall finishing process. So go ahead and take a look at this video. So the question is, at this point, why do finishes, other than perhaps the reason you saw in the video, which is to print a design on them? And there are many reasons why, and if you'll notice here, a lot of the terms on this slide as far as reasons why you'd be doing a finish or a finish would be performed relates to fiber properties. So basically, finishes are done in order to improve the aspects of the fibers that directly relate to fiber properties. So finishes are done to improve aesthetics, and they can be done to improve the luster. Perhaps, let's say you're using a cotton fabric that doesn't necessarily have a lot of luster. You can make it more lustrous by putting a finish on it. You can also affect the texture and the hand of fabrics. Finishes are done to improve appearance retention, to improve comfort and make them more absorbent. This last one here is sort of a biggie, to improve durability and performance for special purposes. So a lot of times flame resistance on fabrics will be achieved via a finish that's done towards the end of the process. But generally overall, the whole idea of a finish is to make the fabric better than what it is in its almost organic stage you can think of, or how it naturally comes out, regardless of whether the fibers used are natural or manufactured. But once those fabrics are finished, or completed, we could say, then you put the finishes are done to just improve and make the fabrics even better on top of what's already been done in terms of their makeup and the components of the fabrics. Having just gone over the different purposes for finishing fabrics, we're going to look at each one individually and the options within each category. So the first category in the last slide was aesthetic finishes. And the first one we're going to talk about within that genre are finishes meant to improve luster. So these finishes are focused on changing the appearance or hand of the fabrics. And oftentimes the fabric's name will reflect whatever finish was added on to it. So there's some correlation there. So luster finishes are meant to produce a change in the fabric's light reflectance. So again, that's mostly to improve the shine is what we're talking about. So one of the first options for a luster finish is a glazed finish, and that's where the fabric is passed through a finishing solution, partially dried, and then calendared, which is basically passed through a series of pressure rollers that move faster than the fabric. So examples of this are polished cotton and glazed chintz, and you can see a sample of that in your kit under number 3. CRS or CRS, depending on how you want to pronounce that, is similar to glazing, and however the roller is hot, so that gives it a greater luster, and in other words, a wet look. And then plasticizing is where a very thin layer of polymer is added for luster, and the bonus effect there is that the fabric becomes soil resistant and water repellent as a result. So sometimes one finish might lead to some other positive properties that are added to these fabrics. Continuing with luster finishes, the first one here is moire, which is where a wood grain or watermarked appearance is put onto the fabrics. Number 69 gives you, in your kit, gives you a good example of that. And there's also a picture of that here on the left. The Shriner finish produces a softer luster than all the others, and that's because the calendar is engraved with extremely fine lines that you can basically only see under a microscope. And then the embossed finish is good for heat-sensitive fibers because it produces a durable, washable pattern. It's almost kind of like stamping, so I put this picture here of an embossing stamp so you can get an idea of that type of finish. There are 4 primary finishes to improve drape on fabrics. The first one is the transparent and crisp finish, which basically amounts to treatment by sulfuric acid, or when the fabric is treated that way, and that's called parchmentizing. You may have heard of parchment paper. It has to be done very carefully because if the acid dissolves too much, it can actually destroy the fabric and make it quite a bit weaker. So it does have to be carefully used, but so that's the first drape finish. The second is called burned out finish, and number 198 gives you a really good example of that, but that's when a chemical solvent is printed onto the fabric that is usually made of different generic fibers, and then one fiber reacts to the solvent and leaves sort of a sheer area, but the other one doesn't, and that's how the pattern is created. So again, take a look at that one. It's better explained by just looking at a visual, but that's what that type of finish is referred to as. And then there's sizing or starching, which adds stiffness and weight to a fabric, and then there's also weighting the fabric, which is just done to add body. So those are the finishes that improve drape. In terms of aesthetic finishes, fabrics can also be manipulated so that the texture and hand can be improved. So the best way to really get an idea of all of these different types of finishes is to just go look at them in your kit and, feel them and get a visual idea of what we're talking about here. But you'll see embossing again, and which is that raised sort of three-dimensional pattern. Pleating is a variation of embossing. Surfaces can also be puckered, flocked, embroidered, which is when they're decorated with surface-applied thread. So there's several different options under texture and hand, and these are usually relate to increased cost for fabrics when all this type of stuff starts to be done to the different fabrics. And again, there are some that are done for a specific use, so again, the cost makes sense in those scenarios, but these are the different ways that the texture and hand of fabrics can be manipulated and or improved. At this point, you're probably thinking that there are a ton of different types of finishes, and yes, there definitely are. So again, the best thing to do at this point is to, of course, follow along here, but look through your kit and look at the different types of fabrics under the different finishes, and it's a great time to start really using the index if you haven't already, and just kind of flip back and forth and look at the different samples and then see what's going on there for each one. For this particular slide, I just want to note the brushed finish. That's where the surface is brushed to clean off the fiber ends, often after shearing the fabrics. So this is where corduroy comes from, and or that's what corduroy is. that's kind of the major takeaway here. And napping is when a layer of fiber ends are raised from the ground weave by a mechanical brush. So there's, I mentioned I think a slide ago that a lot of times these finishes result in higher costs to the fabrics, but that's not true for every single type of finish. So napping is a finish that is actually a little bit lower in terms of cost. But generally speaking, yes, there is some cost involved. Any additional step along the way of the fabrication process is, of course, going to increase costs overall. But just note, creping, fulling, and beetling are also additional finishes that improve texture in hand. Here's a close-up look at some of the finishes that were discussed in the prior slides. So the puckered surface finish and the plissé finish, those are the top two, and you can see how the overall texture has been manipulated on those fabrics. And then the bottom two just give you an idea of what the brushed and nap finishes look like. Now we're moving into special purpose finishes, and this is actually chapter 18 in your textbook. And the first two we're going to look at are shrink control and shape retention, or that being the purpose of these particular finishes. So in terms of shrink control, the finish that helps with shrinkage is known as heat setting. And basically what occurs here is the fabrics are heated at or above their transition temperature, and what that does is actually sort of set it, hence the name, so that they won't change after that point when they're set at any lower temperature. So obviously the temperatures that are achieved in this commercial process are much higher than, let's say, temperatures that the end user would use in washing and that sort of thing. So it's basically, it's almost like thinking of the fabric has been manipulated to the highest possible degree that it ever would be, and then thereafter it stays at that point. So for specific fibers, for example for wool, I put that here because there's a surface coating and or halogenation processes, and that is actually just a treatment to help dissolve the scales of the wool fiber. If you remember from many chapters ago, that's or the wool fibers are scaly, and so there's a treatment to dissolve some of those scales, so that helps with shrink control. And then for rayon fibers, there's resin treatments that can be done in order to prevent rayon from shrinking. So again, if you remember just from back towards the beginning of the course when we talked about the wrinkle factor, the shrink factors with respect to these particular fibers, they were relatively high. And so this is the point at which a finish can be applied in order to help combat those issues. In terms of shape retention, same sort of process here. The durable press is a finish that is used. It's also sometimes referred to as permanent press or wrinkle-free finishes. But this again is when the shape is fixed under a high temperature so that at any subsequent lower temperature it won't change again. And so again, and with this particular finish, it's applied either straight to the fabrics or to the actual garments once they are completely manufactured. So it varies a little bit there. But again, these are the finishes that relate to shrink control and shape retention. Here are several finishes that improve appearance retention for different fabrics. So abrasion resistance, for those types of fabrics, there is an acrylic resin that's applied to sort of fix the fabric in a firmer situation. And these finishes are focused on areas that get the most abrasion. So pockets and linings and the places where there's just going to be basically a lot of friction. Fume fading resistant finishes are used on dyed fabrics that are susceptible to fading when they're exposed to different types of fumes. Light stabilizing finishes add ultraviolet absorbing compounds to minimize light damage. So we've all seen outdoor fabrics that have spent a little bit too much time outdoors and start to fade. These types of finishes can be applied to those to help minimize that process and just make it just take a lot more time before the fading occurs. Pilling resistant finishes. We talked a bit prior in the semester about the pilling that occurs with sweaters and stuff like that when you get those tiny balls that form on the surface of your garments. So there's finishes to help minimize that. Additionally, especially with respect to, let's say, white cotton t-shirts and that sort of thing that tend to yellow after some wear, there are anti-yellowing finishes that can be applied to help minimize that process as well. And then there are the finishes that relate to comfort. So the first here is water repellent or waterproof finishes, and those of course are for things like diving suits and those garments and other products that where water repellency is extremely important. The moisture management finishes are those that help remove sweat from the skin surface and help cool the body. So I put the picture of the Under Armour shirt there to remind us about what type of finish that is, but that's basically where the concept of wicking comes from. Water absorbent finishes increase water absorbency, and as a result of that, the drying speed gets a bit slower, but that does quicken the dyeing process. So there's kind of a trade-off there. There's ultraviolet absorbent finishes. So those are the ones that that you'll see on UV protecting clothes. And then anti-static finishes, fabric softeners, and that sort of thing. And again, all of these are generally related to overall comfort. So depending on what the final purpose of a garment or a product is going to be, is going to directly relate to whatever finish is going to be focused on at the manufacturing stage. So there's pretty much finishes for just about anything you can think of in terms of fabric improvement. So that also includes finishes related to controlling biological issues. So there are finishes to control insects and moths from having a meal off of a wool or a wool blended fabric, for example. There are finishes that can control mold and mildew. You might have seen that sometimes on shower curtains where it says mold and mildew resistant and that type of thing. So those products have been treated with a mold and mildew control finish. There's rot-proof finishes, which these types of finishes relate a little bit more to outdoor furniture fabrics that are used in those areas because they're a little bit more susceptible to rot. But there's also antimicrobial finishes that help with bacteria, and so they basically help create antibacterial fabrics. So again, finishes are available for most of the issues with fabrics that you can think of that you might want to help guard against, and even getting into these different biological issues. Finally, we have the finishes that are more safety related. So here's where we have our flame retardant finishes and light reflecting finishes. So flame retardant finishes are basically placed on because sheer or lightweight fabrics and napped or pile surfaces burn quickly. So for that reason, a finish can be applied to help make these types of fibers flame retardant. So that can be especially important for firefighters, obviously, and other apparel used in other industries where flame retardant safety is extremely important. There's also liquid barrier finishes, and those are really important in agricultural and chemical situations. And then light reflecting finishes to help increase visibility of wear. So I gave you a construction vest here, or actually that might even be a traffic safety vest. But those types of finishes are used on garments and in products where visibility is extremely important. So again, these types of finishes are expensive. They're going to increase the final price, which is why a lot of the uniforms and gear associated with these are needed in these situations where safety finishes are important do tend to be a bit more expensive. Here's some photographs so you can see how the different finishes will actually look up close and work a little bit on some of them anyway. So on the top left you can see the cotton fabric that has a water repellent finish, and you can see how the water is sort of beating up on the fabric instead of getting directly absorbed into it. So that's actually a really nice picture of a finish at work there. The stain resistant in the middle on the top there to kind of keep the stains from fully absorbing into the fabric there. The cotton shirt fabric on the right, that has been treated with a durable press finish. So this is a little bit harder to see obviously, but you just sort of get the idea that that particular garment would be very is not going to change shape after having been treated with that finish. The moth upholstered wool fabric is on the bottom left there. You can see flame retardant sleepwear fabric in the center. Again, can't really see the finish, but just sort of have an idea of what these different finishes are used for and what types of products they relate to. And then on the bottom right, you can see the antimicrobial finish that would be used on something like a cotton dish towel. So this gives you an idea of how the finishes directly relate to the end products. So here is our recap slide to sort of review the topic of finishing. And all of the main points that we discussed within this lecture are here. So gray goods and finished goods, and you will need to know the difference between that for your final, as well as the purposes of finishing. So we talked about the finishes that relate to aesthetics, appearance retention, comfort-related finishes, those that are meant to control biological issues, and then safety-related finishes. So one of the best ways to study this particular topic is to think about the final purpose for an apparel item or another textile item, and then consider the finishing method that would be best for that, and then of course use your kit to see some of the fabrics that are in that genre. Another great thing to do would be to research videos online of different finishing techniques that interest you, or those that are just it's kind of difficult to read about or even to lecture about some of these processes. A lot of times it's easier just to go watch a video on how some of the finishes are achieved. So that's another really good idea in terms of studying and really getting a good conceptualization of the concepts.
So for activity 10, we're going to be working with the finishes that we've just learned about. And for this assignment, what I'd like you to do is think of an experience where you've had some kind of a discomfort. It could be with apparel or an interior textile, could be a backpack, and that discomfort would be anything from something that shrank to something that might have pilled or static, yellowing, fading, or anything else that might have caused you some kind of discomfort. And what you're going to do is you're going to, in a 6-sentence paragraph, explain what happened, and then you're going to suggest an appropriate finish or finishes that could have possibly solved that problem that you had with that particular item. So I'm looking forward to reading these. They will be uploaded under discussions on Canvas, and as all of the other activities, they will be due, or this one will be due on Friday at 5 p.m.